Really good to join you from my home in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But as you heard in the beginning, I spend quite a bit of time teaching in the US and in Australia, sometimes there with you in the UK and Europe. And one of the things I find interesting, that even though I'm teaching in different countries, different cities with different people, it's amazing how common our challenges often are, and how often similar difficulties, similar challenges, similar questions come up. And one that comes up is a theme that I've been exploring quite a bit because it does come up so often. So as you know, the title is Equanimity, Finding Moments of Ease in the Midst of It All. And just to acknowledge, there are quite a few assumptions in that title. So one is that for most of us, ease is not a common experience. In other words, ease is often something that's in short supply. And I think it's fair to say that most of us, most of the time, are having to navigate the everyday challenges just that come from having this human body. The ordinary everyday issues that we have to deal with, that the Buddha named as dukkha, as unsatisfactoriness, of stress, distress, suffering. So probably don't even need to name them, but things like work pressure and financial stress and relationship issues and health challenges and family problems. And then on top of all that, there are the broader societal and global problems, these days being called a polycrisis. So again, I'm not even going to name all the horrific wars and the increasing political polarization, the intensifying social injustice, the rapidly escalating climate crisis. So even right now, we might be not perhaps experiencing an abundance of ease. But I like to check, is it's possible, is anyone here experiencing an abundance of ease from the minute you wake up pretty consistently through your whole day, right through to this evening? Yeah, usually I don't see too many raised hands. I think the people who are in that category don't bother to sign up for a talk like this. So, based on my own life experience and the people I meet with in sanghas around the world, there's a lot going on for most people. And that's why in the title of the talk I put moments of ease, because I don't want to make too many, promise too much. Because already many of us tend to bring an unrealistic, maybe even idealistic attitude to our Dharma practice. And we can have this unconscious belief that somehow, no matter what's going on in our lives, we should be able to just flow with it all and rest in perfect equanimity. And then when we can't do that, when we find ourselves getting reactive and exhausted and depressed, we either blame ourselves for not being good enough, or maybe we blame the practice for not working. And I'll say a little bit more about that kind of conditioning later in the talk. For now, I want to explore this issue of non-ease, of unease, of dis-ease in a bit more detail. And I'll be using a template that I think all of you are familiar with. So the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths. So as you may know, he borrowed this template from the medical healers in the India of his day. And they had a four-part approach to healing. In the Buddha's context, that healing, not so much physical disease, but you could say our existential dis-ease or unease. So the first step is to identify the problem, dis-ease, the suffering or dukkha. And in terms of this talk, it's the dukkha of not being at ease, which often shows up as feeling too busy, pressured, burdened, having too much to do, not enough time to do it in, not enough support, just a general sense of overwhelm. And I think most of us, based on your response earlier, know this experience of non-ease, at least at times. So we know what the issue is. The next step in the Buddha's approach is to work out what is causing it. And there are a couple of levels that I'd like to explore here. The first is our own personal or individual contribution to feeling overwhelmed. So all of us have our own personality, our individual conditioning that contribute to this. Some of us have the tendency to be trying to do way too much, maybe driven by fear of missing out, or wanting to feel needed or important. So we cram our calendars full and we race from one thing to the next without a break and find ourselves overwhelmed. Some people have conditioning where they just naturally orient to be helping other people all the time, but they forget about themselves. And so they get way too involved and take on far too much out there, and it ends up costing them, again, that sense of overwhelm. For some others, there might be an unconscious fear, even terror, of what they might discover if they stopped, even for a moment, and had to experience any of the emotions that might be desperately trying to ward off through overwork and constant busyness. Now, even if none of those particular patterns sound familiar, there are many other habits and patterns and defenses that all of us have that tend to drive non-ease. So you might explore that for yourself, perhaps, either individually or with a Dharma friend. What kind of patterns and habits might be pushing you, the personal and family conditioning that might be pushing you into this lack of ease? And then on top of that, or maybe underneath it, around it, is our collective, our societal conditioning. Most of us live in capitalist societies, and those tend to reward productivity above everything else. And they tend to instill competitive and individualistic values. And those values reinforce a sense of disconnection from each other, disconnection from the natural world that we're part of. And we can easily forget or override the truth that we too are natural. We're organisms. We are flesh and blood beings. We have sensitive human bodies, sensitive human hearts, sensitive human minds. We're not machines or robots, even though we often have that expectation. We should be able to just keep performing the next task, the next, without ever giving ourselves real rest. And when we lose that connection with our true nature, and we punish ourselves with those unrealistic expectations of what we should be able to do and get and have and achieve, no matter what else is going on in our lives, it's no wonder that so many people these days are struggling with anxiety and burnout and overwhelm. So now we have some sense of some of the causes of our unease or non-ease, dis-ease. We can bring in the lens of the third noble truth, which is the good news. It acknowledges freedom from suffering is possible. So in this context, ease is possible. At least moments of ease are possible, no matter what's going on in our lives. Now, just to be clear, when I use the word ease, I'm not talking about just sort of blobbing out on the couch or binge watching Netflix series or being on holiday in a resort somewhere. Even if that was possible, those moments of escape, they're just temporary relief. And when the series is over or the holiday ends, we're right back where we started. Instead, what I'm talking about here is more a quality of inner ease. It's a heart quality of spaciousness, of flow, of acceptance, of resilience. And that kind of ease helps us to maintain some degree of steadiness, no matter what life brings us. So these qualities of spaciousness, of flow, of acceptance, of resilience, these are all aspects of what the Buddha referred to as equanimity, or balance or peace. And pretty much all of his teachings and the practices he offered are aiming at this peace, this equanimity. And it works in both directions. We need some degree of ease for transformative insights to arise. And those insights help us to access deeper ease, and in return, strengthen the conditions for even deeper insight to develop. So, going on retreat for most of us gives us the supportive conditions for that kind of interplay of equanimity and insight. But it's not necessary. Well, it's not. We can also have similar insights even in everyday life. And you may know in the suttas there are accounts of people having profound realization, even in the midst of mundane activities, throwing out the bathwater or extinguishing an oil lamp, or even just lying down to go to sleep at night. You may know the story of the Buddha's attendant Ananda, who apparently had been trying to develop some profound degree of insight. And he spent the whole night sitting and walking, putting quite a lot of pressure on himself. And eventually, he just got exhausted. He gave up. And according to the story, as he lay down to sleep, as his head hit the pillow, insight flowered. And I find that a really interesting story because, like Ananda, I think many of us get caught in expectations and striving and making effort that's actually counterproductive. And it wasn't until he relaxed and let go that what he wanted was able to flower. So, given that ease is so important in this path of practice, how do we find it? And this brings us to the fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth being the Noble Eightfold Path. And this asks us to set up the conditions that support more ease. Now, obviously, it's not enough just to wish, oh, I wish I wasn't so busy, so stressed, so exhausted, so overwhelmed. We need to make structural changes to our lives, most of us, that can help to maybe not fully release, but at least reduce the busyness and the stress and the exhaustion. So the first step in this whole process is one I've already touched into, getting clearer about how we're living and what we're doing to ourselves by bringing mindfulness to these patterns of how we're behaving and acting and reacting. So mindfulness, as always, is the crucial first step. Mindfulness in the bigger picture of how we're living our lives, and mindfulness on a more moment-to-moment level. So all through the day, we want to be recognizing the building of tension, of stress, distress, so that we can keep de-escalating it before that buildup gets too intense. So in my own life, I experience this building up of stress as having a kind of a forward momentum to it. It's like a pressure that's just pushing me to go faster and faster and faster, develops its own momentum, unless I keep putting the brakes on it. So I think of mindfulness as being like speed bumps in the road. I don't know if you call them speed bumps in the UK, but those raised little platforms on suburban streets that are meant to sort of slow the traffic down. And I think of mindfulness as being like that. I'm putting speed bumps in the buildup of that inner pressure so I can keep de-escalating it. So meditation, regular daily meditation, is a very powerful speed bump. And I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you how many people do that, because I know that one of the first things that disappears when we're feeling stressed and busy and overwhelmed, what's one of the first things that drops off our daily routine? For many people, it is meditation. Other things can feel more urgent, more pressing, more crucial. But if that's true for you, I really encourage you to challenge that belief. Even to experiment with a statement that I heard a few years ago now. If you're too busy to meditate, meditate more. Very counterintuitive. But apparently there's also a Zen saying, you should sit in meditation for 20 minutes a day. Unless you're too busy, then you should sit for an hour. So both of these are pointing at the same understanding. And I heard this at a time in my life when I had taken on way too many commitments. I had to learn the hard way, but at that particular time, I was desperate. So desperate that I was even willing to try that experiment that originally had sounded so ridiculous. So in that phase of my life, I was already sitting a couple of times a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. So I decided to try adding in another shorter sit in the middle of the day. And to my amazement, the first time I tried it, I still managed to get through everything I needed to do that afternoon. And I thought, well, that was just a fluke. And the second day, I had an even longer list of things that seemed to urgently need my attention. And I was going to sit, and part of me thought, this is ridiculous. You don't have time. Look at what you have to get through. But I overrode that impulse. I did the extra sitting anyway. And to my amazement, the same thing happened. I got up from sitting. I got through everything that needed doing. And this went on for an entire week. But even after repeated information to the opposite, there was still an inner battle. Every time I had to convince myself, yes, this is worth doing. So if you recognize that, I encourage you, it doesn't have to be 20 minutes, even 10 minutes, any speed bump at all, just sort of de-escalates the nervous system so that when you do get up to do what you need to do, there's less sort of drag, less of your energy is frittered and I'm so busy, oh God. That calms down a bit so we're more effective. So the other challenge, just to acknowledge, is that when we are in those phases of busyness and overwhelm, we sit down to meditate, usually with some unconscious hope that we're going to experience some calm and quiet and relief. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. We often have an unrealistic expectation that we should be able to live our lives at 90 miles an hour, then sit down to meditate and boom, all of that worrying and planning and agitation will just disappear and we'll sit in deep ease and peace for the entire time. And it's obvious when I state it like that, that that's not realistic. Nevertheless, we often get really discouraged when we try to meditate and we just sit tormented by all kinds of agitation and anxiety. And often, again, we blame ourselves, thinking we can't do it, we're a hopeless meditator, we're wasting our time, or we think, well, meditation just doesn't work for me. And it's true. It's not easy to sit still while the mind is racing. But instead of assessing the value of that meditation by how much ease and peace we might get, usually it's more helpful to recognize what are the other skillful states that are being developed there. So yeah, you might not have the deepest samadhi, you might not experience profound peace, but just the fact that you showed up, you're strengthening patience, you're strengthening persistence and steadiness and courage and kindness and compassion, self-compassion, equanimity, and so on. Some of you might recognize in there some of the qualities of the 10 parami, those 10 qualities of character that get developed in daily life. And that's a useful frame of reference for our daily life practice. So I encourage you at the end of a sitting just to jot down 2 or 3 words about the qualities that got strengthened there. Yeah, there's patience. Yeah, I stuck with it. Yeah, there was resolve and so on. Because doing that gives you a positive feedback loop and encourages you that this meditation is making a difference, even if it doesn't always feel pleasant. And this orientation to take in what's going well is super important, because in the midst of a hectic life and because of our perfectionistic tendencies, it's easy for meditation to become a duty, a chore, just one more thing to check off on our to-do lists, and then to feel guilty about if that doesn't happen. So as I was doing in the guided meditation earlier, I often encourage people to tune into what they enjoy about the practice, to try to recognize even tiny moments that are pleasant. So I offered a few during the meditation. So just the sense of sitting and being supported by the cushion, feeling the relaxation as you breathe out. Perhaps the temperature in the room is pleasant. So you're tuning the mind away from its inbuilt negativity bias to take in what it can appreciate, maybe even enjoy. And those little moments of subtle pleasantness, again, make it more likely that we're willing to meditate again the next time. Okay, so maintaining a regular meditation practice is a good foundation to be able to find ease in the rest of the day too. And there's one other powerful place to bring awareness to, and that's to the transitions between tasks or events that all of us go through multiple times a day. So again, dominant mainstream conditioning doesn't generally have us recognize these transitions on any scale, big or small. It's almost like we're programmed to just keep doing, next. But as I said earlier, that goes against our organic nature. Just like everything else in nature, there are rhythms, there are cycles of action and rest. And if we keep overriding those cycles, we just accumulate more and more stress until eventually we burn out or break down. So just in the context of an ordinary day, I've been trying to bring more awareness to consciously finishing one particular task or action, and then taking a moment to pause, maybe just taking 1 or 2 or 3 full breaths, and only then moving on to whatever's next. So consciously finishing or acknowledging what's just ended, taking a moment to breathe, and then engaging with the next thing. So even, for example, when I finish a meeting on Zoom, in the old days, I just click leave meeting and then flick immediately to my emails or jump up to make a cup of tea. But now I try to leave the Zoom meeting almost ceremoniously. And I click leave meeting. Sometimes I close the lid of my laptop. I say goodbye to whoever was on the screen. I let myself register the meeting as ended. I let the presence of those people fade away. And then after a moment, I'll go to what's next. And in some ways, this is similar to a practice I learned about when I did a foundation year of Zen chaplaincy training a few years ago. The trainers were talking about their experience of being hospital chaplains. And in that situation, you go from room to room, seeing many patients a day. And one of them said that, the hospital protocol is you have to sanitize your hands before you go into the next room. So he would make that process of sanitizing his hands almost a ritual. So he'd be cleansing his hands and also releasing whatever had happened in the previous room. So that after a minute or so, when he stepped into the next room, he had as much freshness and openness as he could to meet the next person. So metaphorically, I look for ways of doing that throughout my life. Maybe depending if you work, how you get to and from work. When you first come into the house, take a moment to breathe. If you're in your car, don't just turn off the engine and jump out. Take a moment just to sit and recognize, now I'm at home, and so on. So again, this might be counter to our multitasking culture. But I read a few years ago that every time the brain switches its attention to something new, it releases a small dose of cortisol to help us focus. And as you may know, cortisol is a stress hormone. So when we're constantly jumping from website to website or task to task, we're actually microdosing ourselves with stress hormones. So it's no wonder that at the end of the day, we might feel frazzled. So again, this is why I'm suggesting take 1 or 2 breaths between the new things we do, and that can help offset the building up of the stress hormones. So micro-pausing can be really helpful. And then whenever we can, too, building in slightly longer times for rest, for refreshment, for renewal. Consciously taking time out to do as little as possible. And in the context of contemporary culture, that is pretty radical. Even going on retreat these days can challenge some of our deepest societal conditioning around that constant productivity. And I meet so many students, and know this from myself in the early days, being constantly productive is almost a way of justifying our very existence. And in conventional society, if we aren't producing, if we aren't doing, if we aren't achieving, we may as well be dead. So it's an act of rebellion to resist the tyranny of constant productivity and to allow ourselves to simply be. So I found out that in the US, there's an activist called Trish Hersey, and she's established an organization called the NAP Ministry, the Ministry of NAP. And she's written a manifesto called Rest is Resistance. Maybe some of you know it. But she describes it as a call to action and a manifesto for those who are sleep deprived, searching for justice, and longing to be liberated from the oppressive grip of grind culture. And even this term grind culture woke something up, reveals some conditioning I hadn't been aware I was carrying. And I started to wonder what would happen if I took 5 minutes every day to do nothing. And if you're anything like me, maybe some of you are noticing some resistance even to that idea. It can be a call for all those inner voices to flood in. Oh, what a waste of time. That sounds ridiculous. What good is that going to do? Sounds pretty self-indulgent. I think she's trying to turn us all into couch potatoes. But what if I did rest? Maybe I'd like it too much. No, I don't deserve to rest. Too many people depend on me. They couldn't cope. I have to keep going and going and going and going. I don't know if you recognize any of those kind of voices, but that's partly why I'm inviting this practice, because it can help to reveal some of that deeper societal conditioning. So you might even play if I asked you to take 5 minutes away from the screen. What might you, I'll say do because that's conventional language, but how might you be, or what might support you to soothe this whole nervous system, to rest, to refresh, to renew it? So I'll circle back to that question at the end, but I'll share just a few examples that people have offered in previous talks. One person said, well, I'd go outside and I'd just look at the night sky and I'd stare at the stars for 5 minutes. Somebody else said, I'd just bring my cat onto my lap and I'd feel them purr for 5 minutes. Somebody else said, I would lie down under a soft blanket and just rest. One person had chronic health issues and was not very mobile, but they said, I would go outside and I have bubbles and I would blow bubbles for 5 minutes and watch them. So I wonder, what might any of you do to challenge this constant productivity that so many of us are caught up in, and start to reclaim this capacity to refresh, to restore, to renew, to find these moments of ease in the midst of it all?